Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Nigeria, already Africa's most populous nation, now its largest economy and soon playing host to the World Economic Forum on Africa. But go behind the numbers and the headlines and not everything's so rosy. We see where the violence and a huge wealth gap are slowing Nigeria's progress. Also this week, more from Africa, including Aviation. The head of the International Air Transport Association tells us why he believes safety is still the biggest issue for Africa's airlines. We also talk about the loss of flight MH370 and how that will impact air travel.
Money, money, money.
And the Cuban evolution. We'll see what impact 4 years of Raul Castro's free market reforms are having on the Caribbean island nation. So a big focus on Africa this week, and really a continuation of something we talked about a few weeks ago. Back then we were looking at the stagnation of what was the continent's biggest economy, South Africa. Now it's about Nigeria, which has leapfrogged South Africa into first place after its GDP was revised up by 89%. That's an economy of around $509 billion, which on the face of it makes Nigeria the big African story. But think about the recent upsurge in violence there, the huge wealth gap as well. Are these the stories of a truly strong economy? Here's a few points to get us started this week. Yes, Nigeria is the world's 8th largest oil exporter, but almost 90% of its export earnings are tied to oil. It has the 7th highest population in the world, 170 million people, but over 80% of them are living on less than $2 a day, and most of the actual wealth is confined to a small urban middle class. And there's instability too. The recent attacks on Abuja have been blamed on the armed group Boko Haram. At the very least, they highlight an increased geopolitical risk with investing in Nigeria. And so what's needed? Well, clearly some diversification away from oil, that'd be a start. But Nigeria's needs are actually more basic than that. For example, in Lagos State, where the government's struggling to even provide water to the population. Have a look at this from Yvonne Ndege as she explores the sub-industry of well diggers, providing water for others and a living for themselves.
Using basic tools like a shovel and bucket, Ololade Rabiu is digging a well in Igbogbo, Lagos. She'll have to dig down 60 feet until she finds water. That will take about 2 weeks and cost her customer $500. Before she finishes digging for the day, Ololade checks on a well in the same compound that she had dug previously. All seems to be working well.
I dig these wells because of my children, to get money to eat, to send them to school. The people in the area here also cannot get water. The Water Commission does not have any water pumps around here. I do this so people don't have to suffer to get water.
Millions of people in Lagos rely on informal wells to get water to their homes for cooking, cleaning, taking a bath and for drinking. Like Margaret, who's had hers for the last 12 years.
I decided to do the water, to use it for my house use. To drink, wash clothes, the water is very good, pure.
Most homes in Lagos are not connected to the state-run water network, so don't get any water at all.
The population of Lagos State is huge, and it's one reason the state has not been able to supply water to everyone. People here need more than 2 billion litres of water a day, but the state has only been able to provide less than half of that.
The government say another problem is that there's not enough electricity in the state to power its 48 water supply plants, and they're worried about the informal wells dug by people like Ololade.
We are concerned about the alternative sources of water, starting with adverse environmental impact of digging of wells, boreholes, which may lead to land subsidence due to over-abstraction of groundwater.
But the environment is hardly the main concern for Nigerians who can't get water. With official distribution under sole government control, experts say privatization would help increase supply. The government has no control over the informal wells being built across the state. But until they can improve water supply, the use of informal wells is likely to increase.
Well, let's expand on this Nigeria story now with Razia Khan. She's the head of Africa Research at Standard Chartered in Dubai for this week. Look, Razia, it's obviously great for Nigeria on a statistical level to say that it's growing this much and becoming Africa's largest economy, but can you really call it such a success when A, so much of the population is living on so little, and B, the wealth that is there is concentrated in a very small area?
Well, this is the controversy, of course. On the one hand, great news that we're getting more accurate measurement. Everyone has long known that the Nigerian economy was measured only very imperfectly in the past. What it means for Nigeria is that in average terms, per capita incomes effectively increase from around $1,700 prior to the rebasing to as much as $2,700 today. But you're absolutely right to point out that the survey evidence that we do have suggests that around 60% of Nigerians still live on about $1 a day, meaning that the difference between the median, what most people live on, and the average is even greater than it may have been in the past.
Right. Can you tell me a little bit about foreign interest and investment? Because I feel there's a picture painted of, obviously, as we discussed, an oil economy. But that's something that's under threat from kidnappings on those oil installations, which we hear about. You hear about the Boko Haram threats in places like Abuja, attacks there. None of it paints a good picture. I'm wondering what it's doing for foreign investment.
The insecurity element is, of course, a significant factor. The question is, how much does the instability matter for the growth picture? How seriously should foreign investors be taking things? Up until now, most of the foreign direct investment received, the long-term direct investment, has been in the oil sector. And if we look at the data for last year, for example, Nigeria slipped quite considerably. This was mainly because of the non-passage of the petroleum industry bill, an important bit of legislation that is awaited to provide more clarity on the fiscal terms, especially for a lot of offshore investors. Now, with the revelation that Nigeria has a much greater economy size, yes, that is expected to attract FDI, especially in the consumer sector, but there isn't much evidence that that has been happening in great scale. The instability, some of the political volatility in the country could be making some foreign investors adopt a wait-and-see approach to Nigeria. The story is overall compelling. Nigeria is an important economy today. It's likely to become even more important on a global scale in the future. But these factors to do with governance, to do with the certainty of outcomes, to do with political stability, these things do matter.
That is Razia Khan from Standard Chartered, joining us from Dubai. Razia, we thank you very much for your time indeed. Well, a key factor in Nigeria's growth, in fact, growth right across Africa, is how accessible it can be. Literally, how easy can people get there? That's something I discussed earlier in the week with Tony Tyler, who's the CEO of IATA, the International Air Transport Association.
There's a huge amount of room for development in Africa. Of course, the economies in Africa are relatively small and they're taking time to develop. Safety in Africa is perhaps the #1 concern. There are some very good airlines in Africa. The big three of Kenya Airways, Ethiopian Airlines, South African Airways, they're all very good airlines right up there, world-class standards right through. But there are a lot of smaller airlines who are struggling. We at IATA are doing all we can to help them meet the world safety standards, and the African governments came together last year and made a declaration in Abuja which committed to reaching world safety standards in 2015, and we're putting our money where our mouth is. We're helping a lot of the smaller airlines in Africa, even though they're not our members, to reach standards required by the IATA Operational Safety Audit, IOSA, and I'm pleased to say that program's going quite successfully. But safety is one issue, but connectivity is another. A couple of years ago when I was visiting Senegal, I said to my staff, look, I tell you what, while I'm there, just book me to go down to Lagos. I'll go and visit Lagos while I'm in the area. Well, I mean, they booked me via Paris because there wasn't a suitable, convenient way of getting from one to the other. Now, this is.
Did you take the flight?
No, I didn't bother. I went and did a separate trip to Lagos another time. But the point is, the connectivity within Africa is very poor, and that must be holding the continent back in terms of its overall economic development. But it
Does it need the big players to come in more? Because again, Gulf carriers, you notice the likes of Emirates and Qatar are opening a lot more routes into Africa, I guess because no one else is servicing them.
Well, I believe I'm right in saying that something like 80% of intercontinental traffic in and out of Africa is carried by non-African carriers, and this is a huge problem. But what Africa really needs, I believe, is intra-African connectivity. The problem is that many of the larger African countries, despite having signed up many years ago to liberalisation within Africa along the same lines that the European countries have developed, despite having signed up to that in principle, they're not doing it in practice. And so when the successful airline in Africa wants to open a new route within Africa, very often they're being refused. And I think that's holding Africa's economic development back. It's certainly holding their aviation back.
And we'll hear more from Tony Tyler a little later. We'll get his reaction to the aftermath of flight MH370's disappearance and ask about the most pressing issues for commercial aviation as it marks 100 years of existence. But we'll stay in Africa right now, Kenya, where more and more people are using their mobile phones for financial needs. We're talking paying bills, transferring money, even getting loans. And in a place where agriculture is a big part of the economy, even farmers are finding benefits. Catherine Soy has that story.
They don't need smartphones or even bank accounts. These are dairy farmers in central Kenya. They supply milk to one of the country's dairy companies. After delivery, they have to wait at least a month to get paid. But for the first time, the farmers, mainly with less than 5 cows, are able to get loans against their milk deliveries using their mobile phones. It's through a phone application designed by 2 entrepreneurs.
What we wanted to do is to say, could we take it a step further and say, now could we look at the smallest individual, smallest business level, one single farmer? Could we potentially advance the farmer against his business's earnings?
Here's how it works. The farmer applies for a loan through a text message with the amount needed. This message goes to a data system run by Umati Capital. Once approved, the money is sent to the farmer in less than 2 days. The interest rate charged is the same as conventional banks.
Farmers with few animals and crops find it very difficult to access loans from banks and other mobile banking networks. Security is often needed, and the farmer does not have that collateral.
Grace Nyambura has 5 cows that produce about 25 liters of milk a day. She's just applied for a loan of $100 to buy hay and medicine.
Because the milk company takes so long to pay us, I normally end up selling some of my milk very cheaply at the market. The cash helps me to take care of my animals and family until I get paid for what I delivered to the company.
More than 18 million people in Kenya and Tanzania use their mobile phones to do banking transactions. The mobile banking revolution that started in Kenya has opened the door to a whole new generation of customers whose very first bank account is accessed purely through their phones. This man says that the phone loan service is just another step in the revolution.
Most of the corps we've gone to talk to have been turned away by all banks, simply because they're way too small, they don't have collateral, and their asset base is just near zero. What we're able to do is welcome them on board.
So here in a field in rural Kenya, farmers take down the crucial details that will help secure them loans. It's another first here, a platform that they hope will help make their lives a little better.
And speaking of platforms, one of the biggest social media platforms in the world made headlines this week. Not Twitter or Facebook, though. No, it was Weibo, the so-called Twitter of China. It listed on the tech-based NASDAQ stock exchange in New York on Thursday, raising just over $280 million in the process. It actually cut the number of shares offered, but the price did finish up 19% by the close of trading on that first day. Well, Weibo's an interesting one. Based in Beijing, it launched only 5 years ago, and since then is estimated to have attracted nearly 600 million users. In March alone, it had around 144 million active users. Weibo's revenue almost tripled in a year to $188 million. But will that translate to market success? Craig Leeson in Hong Kong has more on what Weibo's all about and why it's chosen to list in the United States.
Weibo is Chinese for microblog. The site is one of the most widely used of all the social networks in China and could best be described as a kind of hybrid between Twitter and Facebook. It is accessed by well over 30% of internet users here and has a market penetration similar to that of Twitter in the United States. When it was launched 5 years ago, it radically changed the way that news is spread in China's highly censored media environment, with protests and grievances against government officials aired on its site. Today, it's still highly monitored by the Chinese government and engages in its own self-censorship.
Everything there now is very constrained, and people from outside who are going to use Weibo, if they are launching it very publicly outside, are going to try to educate people inside of China.
Finding out how many people actually use Weibo is a difficult task because marketing companies and spammers generate millions of zombie accounts. But recent reports suggest that of the more than 500 million registered users, only 10 million generate more than 90% of messages.
So it's a platform for people to express themselves.
Yeah, I use it to keep up to date with news in China. Yeah, it's quite good, useful.
Ironically, Weibo is launching in the United States because under Chinese rules, a company cannot float if it hasn't turned a profit.
And one investor that would have been watching the Weibo IPO with plenty of interest is Alibaba. If you've not heard of it, Alibaba is a Chinese online shopping giant which is 24% owned by the search engine Yahoo and also owns a large stake in Weibo.
Alibaba is really the king of the IPOs right now for China and in general. People think it'll be bigger or as big as Facebook's IPO a couple of years ago. And there actually is an argument to be made that Alibaba is a blessing and a curse for Weibo. It has a big stake in the company, and perhaps some investors thought rather than invest in Weibo, they'd invest in Alibaba when it comes out. But I don't think much will derail the Alibaba IPO. But if the IPO market continues as it has, then JD.com and Jume, we'll see how they fare.
Let's return to our earlier interview with the CEO of IATA, Tony Tyler. IATA being the International Air Transport Association, it represents 240 different airlines, which account for more than 84% of total global air traffic. IATA involves itself with pretty much anything in the aviation business, but its number one concern is safety. So with that in mind, I asked Tony Tyler about the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 and what sort of impact it's having on the aviation industry.
Until we know what caused the reason why the flight ended, we really can't speculate about what we need to do to make sure that what eventually happened to it never happens again. But what we can say already is that we need to make sure that an aeroplane can never disappear from off radar screens like this, so that we can always track aircraft wherever they are. Hasn't been seen necessarily before. The commercial airline industry has been going for 100 years. This is the first time this has happened. But once is too many times, and we must make sure it doesn't happen again.
Do you feel any sort of lasting effect on travellers? I mean, I'll admit, I got on a plane a few weeks ago and was just sort of thinking, this feels a little different to me now. The whole concept of where will this plane go and where will it end up, it sort of almost played on my mind a bit.
I think it's natural that it will play on people's minds. But on the other hand, the world depends on air travel, and air travel is still incredibly safe, the safest form of transport. We published our safety figures last week, and it showed that the 5-year trend is still heading down and down and down in terms of serious accidents and incidents, and it is a very, very safe form of travel. And I think people in their heart of hearts know that, although of course an incident like this will make people think about it.
Every time I do talk to a CEO from an airline, or we go to an air show and these sorts of things, there's always something. It might have been, a few years ago it was oil had hit $100 a barrel, and that was a new reality. Someone else was telling me about concerns with the amount of new stuff that were coming into the industry. When you wake up in the morning and go to work, what is the most pressing concern, I guess, long term that you're thinking of in the airline industry these days?
Well, as you say, there are many.
Other than missing planes, if we put it that way.
There are always plenty of concerns and great difficulties. It is a fiendishly competitive and difficult business. It's a business which is very fragmented, a business where because of the rules on which it's written and on which it's built, you can't effectively consolidate businesses across national borders, and so it's very fragmented and very, very competitive. In the long run, I think we'd all like to see that change so that it could behave more like a normal business with normal access to capital and so on and so forth. But there are, I suppose, what is always in everybody's mind who's associated with this industry. Underneath everything else, that everything else depends on is safety. And that, we say it, but it's true. It's the #1 concern of everyone in the industry.
Well, let's go back to the points you were making earlier. I mean, how do you change the nature of that industry? Because you said it yourself, it's competitive. It is the type of thing which is going to encourage competition because it's, something like 100,000 flights a day or something like that. How do you make a fragmented, competitive industry like that work?
Well, it works extremely well, and one of the reasons it works, and that although there are many different airlines, it's nevertheless an efficient system, is because it's built on global standards. And this is one of the things IATA does a great deal of work in, is making sure that we use the same, all the airlines use the same processes, use the same standards. I mean, simple things like the barcode on your baggage tag. That's a standard thing. It can be read by any baggage reader anywhere. We'll know exactly where that bag is going, where it's come from, what the flight number is, what your name is, and so on. It's all there. And that's a simple little example of the sort of standards that the industry is built on to make sure you get this connectivity and you get some of the benefits, of course, of huge scale coming through to everybody.
Let's look at regions. We'll start with Europe because that's been an ongoing story for 5-6 years now. How do you see aviation in Europe these days in light of all the economic problems there have been there?
It's particularly difficult to run an airline in Europe because taxes are high, infrastructure is poor, and the airspace above Europe is very fragmented. What we'd like to see would be, first of all, a genuinely single European sky which would massively reduce operating costs and increase efficiency. If only aircraft could fly in straight lines and ascend and descend in an efficient way instead of the way they're made to do it now. And by the way, a huge positive impact on the environment if only we could do that.
Tony Tyler there from IATA, which, random fact time, was actually formed in Havana, Cuba back in 1945. And Cuba's where we're finishing up this week, what could be called a Cuban evolution. President Raul Castro introduced a free market reform program nearly 4 years ago, and we want to see how they're working. Daniel Schweimler has this from Havana on how Cubans are adjusting.
Money, serio, money, money.
Lisette is a peanut seller in the heart of old Havana. She's been working for herself for a year, one of the growing number of Cubans working for themselves now that President Raul Castro has loosened centralized state control, designed to help the island's flagging economy.
The advantages of being self-employed are that, thanks to God, I can manage my own income. I don't have to rely on a salary. I can organize the financing of my home and my life.
But she's finding that living without state support also has disadvantages. On her days off, she's at home sorting, cooking and packing her peanuts. And while some burdens of state control have disappeared, others from the free market have arisen.
When I started to sell peanuts, they cost 3 pesos 50. Now they're at 15. Then there are times when they're at 20 pesos. The paper used to cost 10, now it's at 25, then it will go up to 30.
For more than 50 years, all that most Cubans have known is the tightly run state system, often inefficient and overly bureaucratic, providing few incentives to work. Changes are occurring, but they don't come easily. Courses are now run at this college in the center of Havana on some of the aspects that those living in market economies take for granted, such as accounting, marketing and customer service.
We discovered their need to prepare them because we didn't want them to open businesses that would fail, since that wouldn't be good for the economy.
Entrepreneurs, some might call them capitalists, are still a novelty in what is still fundamentally a socialist system.
Pay for the picture, lady.
Lisette is enjoying some of the freedoms that being self-employed brings her. She says herself that she's an individual who works in her own way, but she's also experiencing something of the pressures too.
And there you go, that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com. You can just click through to the programs link, and from there you'll find the Counting the Cost page with all our previous episodes to catch up on. You can get in touch too. You can tweet either me at Kamal AJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and you can use the hashtag Counting the Cost as well. Or just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm taking a little break next week, so it'll be Stephen Cole who'll be looking after you then. But for now, I'm Kamal Santamaria on behalf of the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.